双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Hesiod, the Homeric Hymns, and Homerica, contains translations of the following works. Hesiod, Works and Days. The Theogony, fragments of the catalogues of women and Ioi, the Shield of Heracles, attributed to Hesiod, and fragments of various works attributed to Hesiod. Homer, the Homeric Hymns, the epigrams of Homer, both attributed to Homer. Various fragments of the epic cycle, parts of which are sometimes attributed to Homer. Fragments of other epic poems attributed to Homer. The Battle of Frogs and Mice. And the Contest of Homer and Hesiod. Preface. This volume contains practically all that remains of the post-Homeric and pre-academic epic poetry. I have for the most part formed my own text. In the case of Hesiod, I have been able to use independent collations of several MSS by Dr. W.H.D. Rouse. Otherwise, I have depended on the apparatus criticus of the several editions, especially that of Rzac, 1902. The arrangement adopted in this edition, by which the complete and fragmentary poems are restored to the order in which they would probably have appeared had the Hesiodic corpus survived intact, is unusual, but should not need apology. The true place for the catalogues, for example, fragmentary as they are, is certainly after the Theogony. In preparing the text of the Homeric Hymns, my chief debt, and it is a heavy one, is to the edition of Allen and Sykes, 1904, and to the series of articles in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, volumes 15 SQQ, by T.W. Allen. To the same scholar and to the delegates of the Clarendon Press, I am greatly indebted for permission to use the restorations of the hymn to Demeter. Lines 387 to 401 and 462 to 470, printed in the Oxford text of 1912. Of the fragments of the epic cycle, I have given only such as seem to possess distinct importance or interest, and in doing so have relied mostly upon Kinkell's collection and on the 5th volume of the Oxford Homer, 1912. The texts of the Batrachomyomachia and of the Contest of Homer and Hesiod are those of Baumeister and Flack respectively. Where I have diverged from these, the fact has been noted. Hugh G. Evelyn White, Rampton, N.R. Cambridge, September 9 th. 1914. Introduction. General. The early Greek epic, that is, poetry as a natural and popular, and not, as it became later, an artificial and academic literary form, passed through the usual 3 phases of development, of maturity, and of decline. No fragments which can be identified as belonging to the first period survive to give us even a general idea of the history of the earliest epic, and we are therefore thrown back upon the evidence of analogy from other forms of literature and of inference from the 2 great epics which have come down to us. So, reconstructed, the earliest period appears to us as a time of slow development in which the characteristic epic meter, diction, and structure grew up slowly from crude elements and were improved until the verge of maturity was reached. The second period, which produced the Iliad and the Odyssey, needs no description here, but it is very important to observe the effect of these poems on the course of post-Homeric epic. As the supreme perfection and universality of the Iliad and the Odyssey cast into oblivion whatever pre-Homeric poets had essayed, so these same qualities exercised a paralyzing influence over the successors of Homer. If they continued to sing like their great predecessor of romantic themes, they were drawn as by a kind of magnetic attraction into the Homeric style and manner of treatment, and became mere echoes of the Homeric voice. In a word, Homer had so completely exhausted the epic genre that after him further efforts were doomed to be merely conventional. Only the rare and exceptional genius of Virgil and Milton could use the Homeric medium without loss of individuality. And this quality none of the later epic poets seem to have possessed. Freedom from the domination of the great tradition could only be found by seeking new subjects, and such freedom was really only illusionary, since romantic subjects alone are suitable for epic treatment. In its 3rd period, Therefore, epic poetry shows two divergent tendencies. In Ionia and the islands, the epic poets followed the Homeric tradition, singing of romantic subjects in the now stereotyped heroic style, and showing originality only in their choice of legends hitherto neglected or summarily and imperfectly treated. In continental Greece, on the other hand, but especially in Boeotia, a new form of epic sprang up, which for the romance and pathos of the Ionian school substituted the practical and matter-of-fact. It dealt in moral and practical maxims, in information on technical subjects which are of service in daily life, agriculture, astronomy, augury, and the calendar, in matters of religion and in tracing the genealogies of men. Its attitude is summed up in the words of the Muses to the writer of the Theogony. We can tell many a feigned tale to look like truth, but we can, when we will, utter the truth. Theogony 26-27. Such a poetry could not be permanently successful, because the subjects of which it treats, if susceptible of poetic treatment at all, were certainly not suited for epic treatment, where unity of action which will sustain interest, and to which each part should contribute, is absolutely necessary. While, therefore, an epic like the Odyssey is an organism and dramatic in structure, a work such as the Theogony is a merely artificial collocation of facts, and, at best, a pageant. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that from the first the Boeotian school is forced to season its matter with romantic episodes, and that later it tends more and more to revert, as in the Shield of Heracles, to the Homeric tradition. The Boeotian school. How did the continental school of epic poetry arise? There is little definite material for an answer to this question, but the probability is that there were at least three contributory causes. First, it is likely that before the rise of the Ionian epos there existed in Boeotia a purely popular and indigenous poetry of a crude form. It comprised, we may suppose, versified proverbs and precepts relating to life in general, agricultural maxims, weather lore, and the like. In this sense, the Boeotian poetry may be taken to have its germ in maxims similar to our English, till may be out, ne'er cast a clout, or a rainbow in the morning is the shepherd's warning. Secondly, and thirdly, we may ascribe the rise of the new epic to the nature of the Boeotian people, and, as already remarked, to a spirit of revolt against the old epic. The Boeotians, people of the class of which Hesiod represents himself to be the type, were essentially unromantic. Their daily needs marked the general limit of their ideals, and, as a class, they cared little for works of fancy, for pathos, or for fine thought as such. To a people of this nature, the Homeric epos would be unacceptable, and the post-Homeric epic, with its conventional atmosphere, its trite and hackneyed diction, and its insincere sentiment, would be anathema. We can imagine, therefore, that among such folk a settler, of Aeolic origin like Hesiod, who clearly was well acquainted with the Ionian epos, would naturally see that the only outlet for his gifts lay in applying epic poetry to new themes acceptable to his hearers. Though the poems of the Boeotian school, too, were unanimously assigned to Hesiod down to the age of Alexandrian criticism, they were clearly neither the work of one man nor even of one period. Some, doubtless, were fraudulently fathered on him in order to gain currency, but it is probable that most came to be regarded as his partly because of their general character, and partly because the names of their real authors were lost. One fact in this attribution is remarkable: the veneration paid to Hesiod. Life of Hesiod. Our information respecting Hesiod is derived in the main from notices and allusions in the works attributed to him, and to these must be added traditions concerning his death and burial gathered from later writers. Hesiod's father, whose name, by a perversion of Works and Days, 299 Pers Dion Genos to Pers, Dion Genos, was thought to have been Dios, was a native of Simon Aeolus, where he was a seafaring trader and, perhaps, also a farmer. He was forced by poverty to leave his native place and returned to continental Greece, where he settled at Askra near Thespy in Boeotia. Works and Days. 636 ff. Either in Syme or Askra, 2 sons, Hesiod and Perses, were born to the settler, and these, after his death, divided the farm between them. Perses, however, who is represented as an idler and spendthrift, obtained and kept the larger share by bribing the corrupt lords who ruled from Thespy. Works and Days. 37-39. While his brother wasted his patrimony and ultimately came to want. Works and Days. 34 ff. Hesiod lived a farmer's life until, according to the very early tradition preserved by the author of the Theogony, 22-23. The Muses met him as he was tending sheep on Mt Helicon and taught him a glorious song, doubtless the Works and Days. The only other personal reference is to his victory in a poetical contest at the funeral games of Amphidamas at Chalcis in Euboea, where he won the prize, a tripod, which he dedicated to the Muses of Helicon. Works and Days. 651-9. Before we go on to the story of Hesiod's death, it will be well to inquire how far the autobiographical notices can be treated as historical, especially as many critics treat some, or all of them, as spurious. In the first place, attempts have been made to show that Hesiod is a significant name and therefore fictitious. It is only necessary to mention Goettling's derivation from IEMI to ODOS, which would make Hesiod mean the guide in virtues and technical arts, and to refer to the pitiful attempts in the Etymologicum Magnum, SV. H. Hesiodus, to show how prejudiced and lacking even in plausibility such efforts are. It seems certain that Hesiod stands as a proper name in the full sense. Secondly, Hesiod claims that his father, if not he himself, came from Elis and settled in Boeotia. There is fairly definite evidence to warrant our acceptance of this. The dialect of the Works and Days is shown by Rizak 3 to contain distinct Eolisms apart from those which formed part of the general stock of epic poetry. And that this Aeolic-speaking poet was a Boeotian of Askra seems even more certain, since the tradition is never once disputed, insignificant though the place was, even before its destruction by the Thespians. Again, Hesiod's story of his relations with his brother Perses have been treated with skepticism. See Murray. A.N.C. Greek Literature. Pages 53-54. Perses, it is urged, is clearly a mere dummy, set up to be the target for the poet's exhortations. On such a matter precise evidence is naturally not forthcoming, but all probability is against the skeptical view. For one, if the quarrel between the brothers were a fiction, we should expect it to be detailed at length and not noticed elusively and rather obscurely, as we find it. 2. As M.M. Croiset remark. If the poet needed a lay figure, the ordinary practice was to introduce some mythological person, as, in fact, is done in the Precepts of Chiron. In a word, there is no more solid ground for treating Perses and his quarrel with Hesiod as fictitious than there would be for treating Cernus, the friend of Theognis, as mythical. Thirdly, there is the passage in the Theogony relating to Hesiod and the Muses. It is surely an error to suppose that lines 22-35 all refer to Hesiod. Rather, the author of the Theogony tells the story of his own inspiration by the same Muses who once taught Hesiod glorious song. The lines 22-3 are therefore a very early piece of tradition about Hesiod, and though the appearance of Muses must be treated as a graceful fiction, we find that a writer, later than the Works and Days, by perhaps no more than 3/4 of a century, believed in the actuality of Hesiod and in his life as a farmer or shepherd. Lastly, there is the famous story of the contest in song at Chalcis. In later times, the modest version in the Works and Days was elaborated, first by making Homer the opponent whom Hesiod conquered, while a later period exercised its ingenuity in working up the story of the contest into the elaborate form in which it still survives. Finally, the contest, in which the two poets contended with hymns to Apollo 4, was transferred to Delos. These developments certainly need no consideration. Are we to say the same of the passage in the Works and Days? Critics from Plutarch downwards have almost unanimously rejected the lines 654 to 662, on the ground that Hesiod's Amphidamas is the hero of the Lelantine Wars between Chalcis and Eretria, whose death may be placed circa 705 BC, a date which is obviously too low for the genuine Hesiod. Nevertheless, there is much to be said in defense of the passage. Hesiod's claim in the Works and Days is modest, since he neither pretends to have met Homer, nor to have sung in any but an impromptu, local festival, so that the supposed interpolation lacks a sufficient motive. And there is nothing in the context to show that Hesiod's Amphidamas is to be identified with that Amphidamas whom Plutarch alone connects with the Lelantine War. The name may have been borne by an earlier Chalcidian, an ancestor, perhaps, of the person to whom Plutarch refers. The story of the end of Hesiod may be told in outline. After the contest at Chalcis, Hesiod went to Delphi, and there was warned that the issue of death should overtake him in the fair grove of Nemean Zeus. Avoiding therefore Nemea on the Isthmus of Corinth, to which he supposed the oracle to refer, Hesiod retired to Eno in Locris, where he was entertained by Amphiphanes and Ganymeter, sons of a certain Phegeus. This place, however, was also sacred to Nemean Zeus, and the poet, suspected by his hosts of having seduced their sister, 5, was murdered there. His body, cast into the sea, was brought to shore by dolphins and buried at Eno, or, according to Plutarch, at Ascra. At a later time his bones were removed to Orchomenus. The whole story is full of miraculous elements, and the various authorities disagree on numerous points of detail. The tradition seems, however, to be constant in declaring that Hesiod was murdered and buried at Eno, and in this respect it is at least as old as the time of Thucydides. In conclusion, it may be worthwhile to add the graceful epigram of Alcaeus of Messene, Palatine Anthology, 755. When in the shady Locrian grove Hesiod lay dead, the nymphs washed his body with water from their own springs, and heaped high his grave, and thereon the goatherds sprinkled offerings of milk mingled with yellow honey. Such was the utterance of the 9 muses that he breathed forth, that old man who had tasted of their pure springs. The Hesiodic poems. The Hesiodic poems fall into 2 groups according as they are didactic, technical, or gnomic, or genealogical. The first group centers round the Works and Days. The second round the Theogony. The Works and Days. The poem consists of 4 main sections. A. After the prelude, which Pausanias failed to find in the ancient copy engraved on lead seen by him on Mt. Helicon, comes a general exhortation to industry. It begins with the allegory of the 2 strifes, who stand for wholesome emulation and quarrelsomeness respectively. Then by means of the myth of Pandora the poet shows how evil and the need for work first arose, and goes on to describe the 5 ages of the world, tracing the gradual increase in evil, and emphasizing the present miserable condition of the world, a condition in which struggle is inevitable. Next, after the fable of the hawk and nightingale, which serves as a condemnation of violence and injustice, the poet passes on to contrast the blessing which righteousness brings to a nation, and the punishment which heaven sends down upon the violent, and the section concludes with a series of precepts on industry and prudent conduct generally. B. The second section shows how a man may escape want and misery by industry and care both in agriculture and in trading by sea. Neither subject, it should be carefully noted, is treated in any way comprehensively. C. The third part is occupied with miscellaneous precepts relating mostly to actions of domestic and everyday life and conduct which have little or no connection with one another. D. The final section is taken up with a series of notices on the days of the month which are favorable or unfavorable for agricultural and other operations. It is from the second and fourth sections that the poem takes its name. At first sight, such a work seems to be a miscellany of myths, technical advice, moral precepts, and folklore maxims without any unifying principle. And critics have readily taken the view that the whole is a canto of fragments or short poems worked up by a redactor. Very probably Hesiod used much material of a far older date, just as Shakespeare used the Gesta Romanorum, old chronicles, and old plays. But close inspection will show that the Works and Days has a real unity and that the picturesque title is somewhat misleading. The poem has properly no technical object at all, but is moral. Its real aim is to show men how best to live in a difficult world. So, viewed, the four seemingly independent sections will be found to be linked together in a real bond of unity. Such a connection between the first and second sections is easily seen. But the links between these and the third and fourth are no less real. To make life go tolerably smoothly, it is most important to be just and to know how to win a livelihood. But happiness also largely depends on prudence and care both in social and home life as well, and not least on avoidance of actions which offend supernatural powers and bring ill luck. And finally, if your industry is to be fruitful, you must know what days are suitable for various kinds of work. This moral aim, as opposed to the currently accepted technical aim of the poem, explains the otherwise puzzling incompleteness of the instructions on farming and seafaring. Of the Hesiodic poems similar in character to the Works and Days, only the scantiest fragments survive. One at least of these, the divination by birds, was, as we know from Proclus, attached to the end of the Works until it was rejected by Apollonius Rhodius. Doubtless, it continued the same theme of how to live, showing how man can avoid disasters by attending to the omens to be drawn from birds. It is possible that the astronomy, or astrology, as Plutarch calls it, was in turn appended to the divination. It certainly gave some account of the principal constellations, their dates of rising and setting, and the legends connected with them, and probably showed how these influence human affairs, or might be used as guides. The Precepts of Chiron was a didactic poem made up of moral and practical precepts, resembling the gnomic sections of the Works and Days, addressed by the centaur Chiron to his pupil Achilles. Even less is known of the poem called the Great Works. The title implies that it was similar in subject to the second section of the Works and Days, but longer. Possible references in Roman writers 6 indicate that among the subjects dealt with were the cultivation of the vine and olive and various herbs. The inclusion of the judgment of Rhadamanthys, Frag.1, if a man sow evil, he shall reap evil, indicates a gnomic element, and the note by Proclus 7 on Works and Days 126 makes it likely that metals also were dealt with. It is therefore possible that another lost poem, the Ideondactyls, which dealt with the discovery of metals and their working, was appended to, or even was a part of the Great Works, just as the divination by birds was appended to the Works and Days. 2. The genealogical poems. The only complete poem of the genealogical group is the Theogony, which traces from the beginning of things the descent and vicissitudes of the families of the gods. Like the Works and Days, this poem has no dramatic plot, but its unifying principle is clear and simple. The gods are classified chronologically. As soon as one generation is catalogued, the poet goes on to detail the offspring of each member of that generation. Exceptions are only made in special cases, as the sons of Iapetus, LL. 507 to 616, whose place is accounted for by their treatment by Zeus. The chief landmarks in the poem are as follows. After the first 103 lines, which contain at least 3 distinct preludes, 3 primeval beings are introduced: Chaos, Earth, and Eros, here an indefinite reproductive influence. Of these 3, Earth produces heaven, to whom she bears the Titans, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed giants. The Titans, oppressed by their father, revolt at the instigation of Earth, under the leadership of Kronos, and as a result heaven and earth are separated, and Kronos reigns over the universe. Kronos, knowing that he is destined to be overcome by one of his children, swallows each one of them as they are born, until Zeus, saved by Rhea, grows up and overcomes Kronos in some struggle, which is not described. Kronos is forced to vomit up the children he had swallowed, and these with Zeus divide the universe between them, like a human estate. Two events mark the early reign of Zeus: the war with the Titans and the overthrow of Typhoeus. And as Zeus is still reigning, the poet can only go on to give a list of gods born to Zeus by various goddesses. After this, he formally bids farewell to the cosmic and Olympian deities and enumerates the sons born of goddess to mortals. The poem closes with an invocation of the Muses to sing of the tribe of women. This conclusion served to link the Theogony to what must have been a distinct poem, the Catalogues of Women. This work was divided into 4, Suedasa's 5 books, the last one or two of which was known as the Yoei, and may have been again a distinct poem. The curious title will be explained presently. The catalogues proper were a series of genealogies which trace the Hellenic race, or its more important peoples and families, from a common ancestor. The reason why women are so prominent is obvious. Since most families and tribes claim to be descended from a god, the only safe clue to their origin was through a mortal woman beloved by that god. And it has also been pointed out that Mudirect still left its traces in northern Greece in historical times. The following analysis, after Markstoffel 8, will show the principle of its composition. From Prometheus and Pronoia sprang Deucalion and Pyrrha, the only survivors of the deluge, who had a son Helen, frag. 1, the reputed ancestor of the whole Hellenic race. From the daughters of Deucalion sprang Magnus and Macedon, ancestors of the Magnesians and Macedonians, who are thus represented as cousins to the true Hellenic stock. Helen had 3 sons, Taureus, Xuthus, and Aeolus, parents of the Dorian, Ionic, and Aeolian races, and the offspring of these was then detailed. In one instance, a considerable and characteristic section can be traced from extant fragments and notices. Salmoneus, son of Aeolus, had a daughter Tyro, who bore to Poseidon 2 sons, Peleus and Neleus. The latter of these, king of Pylos, refused Heracles' purification for the murder of Iphitus, whereupon Heracles attacked and sacked Pylos, killing amongst the other sons of Neleus Periclymenus, who had the power of changing himself into all manner of shapes. From this slaughter Neleus alone escaped, frags. 13 and 10-12. This summary shows the general principle of arrangement of the catalogues. Each line seems to have been dealt with in turn, and the monotony was relieved as far as possible by a brief relation of famous adventures connected with any of the personages, as in the case of Atalanta and Hippomenes, frag. 14. Similarly, the story of the Argonauts appears from the fragments, 37-42, to have been told in some detail. This tendency to introduce romantic episodes led to an important development. Several poems are ascribed to Hesiod, such as the Epithalamium of Peleus and Thetis, the descent of Theseus into Hades, or the Circuit of the Earth, which must have been connected with the story of Phineus and the Harpies, and so with the Argonaut legend, which yet seem to have belonged to the catalogues. It is highly probable that these poems were interpolations into the catalogues, expanded by later poets from more summary notices in the genuine Hesiodic work and subsequently detached from their contexts and treated as independent. This is definitely known to be true of the Shield of Heracles, the first 53 lines of which belong to the 4th book of the catalogues, and almost certainly applies to other episodes, such as the Suitors of Helen, 9, the Daughters of Leucippus, and the Marriage of Ceyx, which last Plutarch mentions as interpolated in the works of Hesiod. To the catalogues, as we have said, was appended another work, the Yoei. The title seems to have arisen in the following way: 10. The catalogues probably ended EP. Theogony, 963 ff, with some such passage as this.
But now,